When I first read this headline in my newsfeed, I was shocked. I think we've pretty comprehensively discussed in quite a few videos now on just how enriching we find our lives here in Germany as American citizens. And I mean that in both the existential and economic sense. But as a researcher, particularly somebody who has spent a great deal of time in political economic theory, yeah, this article had me curious, to say the least. Because while I think we have all felt the collective effects of inflation and the toll that it has taken on relative wages, the social media tagline for this article, yeah, it's bold. So I want to do something that I've never done on this channel before. I want to go into detail on this specific article. I want to look at the data. I want to see the evidence that this author brings forward and really understand, are Europeans actually getting poorer and Americans getting richer? Well, let's take a look. All right, so before we actually dive deep into the material itself, just a quick heads up. If you would like to read along with me, I'm going to include a link down below in the description of this video to the actual article from the Wall Street Journal. But just a heads up, it may be behind a paywall. So if you don't actively subscribe to them, you may have some issues actually reading the article for itself. But I should also mention, I'm actually not going to be reading this article verbatim. I'm simply going to be looking specifically at the data that the author brings forward in order to make his point. And any data that I bring to the table as either evidence to support or as a counterpoint to his argument will also be included down below in the description of this video. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So the author starts by providing a timeline and a framework for their analysis. In short, that this issue in Europe has been brewing for some time, and when coupled with an aging population, something that all Western countries are grappling with, the author finds that liberalist ideologies like valuing free time and job security over working themselves to death has produced, quote, lackluster economic and productivity growth. So when you tack on the 1-2 punch of a global pandemic and Russia's war on Ukraine, you ultimately aggravate ailments that have been festering for decades. Their words, not mine. So because of these factors, the author starts off the argument by being relatively critical of the collective European government's response on how to stimulate a crippled global economy, namely giving subsidies to employers rather than directing it primarily to citizens to keep them spending. And to be honest, I find this particular depiction somewhat misleading because while yeah, the US government did give about $1.8 trillion to US individuals and families as part of their various COVID relief packages, they also gave $1.7 trillion to businesses, $80 billion of which came in the form of PPP loans that largely never had to be paid back. But my bigger issue here is that this article really does sort of gloss over just how fundamentally important worker protections are in European employment law. Germany's COVID response was aimed at keeping people employed by making sure they still received their normal paychecks. But in the United States, where at-will employment reigns supreme, American workers, even in good economic times, have very little relative job security. And so in the US during COVID, the unemployment rate increased dramatically from 3.5% to 14.7% from February to April 2020. But in Germany, from February to August 2020, the German unemployment rate only rose slightly from 3.5% to 4.1%. In addition, the US civilian labor force declined by 5% from February to April 2020, while the German labor force decreased from February to May of 2020 at a much smaller 1.5%. Plus, it wasn't like the American government was just shoveling out life-changing sums of money. The average amount of stimulus money was $3,450 for Americans with incomes in the bottom 60%. That includes all Americans earning under $65,000 per year. And don't get me wrong, nearly $3,500 isn't exactly pocket change. But say you happen to be one of those American workers that was earning around $65,000. Well, $3,500 doesn't even amount to one missed paycheck after taxes. But moving on, the article then points to issues surrounding international manufacturing and Europe's heavy reliance on exports. And really, to be honest, I really do actually agree with the author on this particular point. Strengthening domestic demand, the economy's number 2 driver after exports, could happen by increasing wages and state expenditure. And this would not only be useful for Germany alone, but would also show solidarity towards neighbors and partners. But you know, the next 3 statistics that are brought up within this article, I think are fundamentally important for everyone to understand about the economic prosperity and health happening in Europe and the United States. The picture that's painted is that, in contrast to the United States, where positive gains are to be had, European nations are experiencing a decline in private consumption, a decline in global consumption spending, and when adjusting for inflation and purchasing power, a decline in real wages. And yeah, that sounds bad, because it is. After all, the 2 textbook determinants of private consumption, household income and wealth, generally explain the largest part of consumption growth. So when that falls, it speaks to a larger issue happening behind the scenes, and the loss of purchasing power is particularly challenging for workers in low-income households. But the statistic that seemed unusual for me was that real wages have increased in the United States by 6%. I mean, that kind of goes against everything that I've heard from my American friends and colleagues. Are things really that rosy in the United States? I think there's actually a lot to unpack here. So the author is technically correct. Between 2019 and 2022, Americans did see historically higher growth in real wages. The 10th percentile real hourly wage grew 9% over the 3-year period. But in low unemployment labor markets, lower wage and historically marginalized workers do experience better labor market outcomes and faster wage growth. But even with a 9% growth in real wages since 2019, a worker in the lowest 10th percentile still isn't making enough to make ends meet. According to EPI's family budget calculator, whether a worker is making $11.85 an hour or $13.60 an hour, they're still not earning enough to attain a modest yet adequate standard of living. A basic family budget for a single individual with no children in any county or metro area in the United States. And when we look closer at the data, middle wage workers, workers between the 40th and 60th percentiles of the wage distribution, didn't experience similar gains in the recent recovery. And I would fear as an American worker that those gains in real wages could actually be reversing if they haven't already done so. Necessary long-term investments in the US unemployment insurance system have not been made, and many of the relief measures that increased economic security during the pandemic, such as child tax credits, have long since lapsed. In fact, the Economic Policy Institute has been sounding the alarm for the American economy to not get complacent with the transient nature of their own labor market. In fact, they advocate for a policy that prioritizes full employment, strengthens and enforces labor standards, and removing obstacles to workers forming unions. All things that are standard in Europe, but not the United States. Now, moving forward, it looks like the next argument the author provides is relative to the price of goods and the reduction of the consumption of meat. And in all fairness, eating meat has long been considered a sign of prosperity in Germany, and regularly putting a Sunday roast on the table means for many cultures that things are going particularly well for a family. But the decision to not consume as much meat in modern times is not solely an economic decision. Worries over animal welfare, climate change, and higher prices appear to have driven consumers to look for alternatives to meat to fill their plates. And this is anecdotal, but in my personal experience, I've found that my German friends and colleagues care a heck of a lot more about climate-friendly sourcing of their food and reducing meat consumption simply because it's better for the environment and caring a lot more about animal welfare than any of my friends or colleagues in the US ever did. And on that same note of consumption, the author puts forward that Europeans just don't spend money as frivolously as Americans do. Yeah, it's not surprising to me that Europeans aren't as obsessive with their buy it now, pay for it later consumer culture that is extremely prevalent in the United States. But that doesn't mean that they're poorer. In my experience, German consumer culture is centered around buying higher quality goods once, whereas American consumers will often buy lower quality goods frequently. But okay, I think we should keep moving forward here with this, particularly because I think this next statement in the article is shocking. What the author next references, weirdly without saying it outright, is that economic output per capita, it's really just a basic GDP assessment. And numerous, and I mean numerous, research centers have always been critical of blatant GDP shock and awe statements like this. I mean, Senator Robert Kennedy is famously quoted as saying that GDP measures everything, except that which makes life worthwhile. GDP does not measure health, education, equality of opportunity, the state of the environment, or many other indicators of the quality of life. And it doesn't even measure crucial aspects of the economy, such as its sustainability, whether or not it's headed for a crash. And there's a really wonderful article by the Scientific American that discusses something called GDP thinking, seeking to boost GDP and the misplaced expectation that alone would enhance well-being. And they liken this obsession with American GDP and the American economy as, quote, more like an ordinary car whose owner saved on gas by removing the spare tire, which was fine until he got a flat. For example, doing without paid sick leave in meat packing plants, sure, increases profits in the long run, which also, hey, increases GDP. But American workers can't afford to stay home when they're sick. So instead, they came to work, spread the infection, and injured more people. Kind of ironic when the entire angle of this article is that the US weathered the COVID storm better than Europe, right? But this next statement, however, is I think like really what bothers me about this article, because listen, I hate to be blunt, and this is just my opinion, but this is just a dog whistle. Calling universal healthcare and government-supported pension systems a welfare state was deliberately chosen language to pander to a specific crowd. I mean, listen, if we want to have a discussion on the affordability of universal healthcare schemes, then let's have it. But the argument that the author in this article is subtly implying is that the privatized healthcare system in the United States is somehow more affordable. Although he doesn't give any data to support that, because there isn't any. While the United States spends more on healthcare than any other high-income country, the nation often performs worse on measures of health and health care. And despite having the highest rate of multiple chronic diseases of any other OECD country, Americans visit physicians less frequently than European nations, and America has a below average number of practicing physicians. Okay, listen, I don't want to get all worked up here. I think we should keep moving forward, because actually next up in the article is we do actually finally get to the quote that is attributed in the title of this entire article. Yes, we are all worse off. So I actually wanted to better understand the context of this statement. Yes, we're all worse off because, again, it's in the title of this entire article, and I actually did find it. It was given in a podcast by Columbia University. And in my opinion, it's taken wildly out of context. For starters, Hill was warning both UK and US citizens about the rising effects of inflation and the role of higher wages on exacerbating economic strain. And although the quote that they were poorer was indeed said in the context of UK energy prices, he's the chief economist for the Bank of England. He was simply giving a personal example, but very much talking in language and in theories surrounding inflation and economic strain on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The central point that he was making was that high inflation would persist if companies remained unwilling to take a hit on their profit margins, and employees, again, including American employees, resisted declines to their purchasing power. And this was very much not a uniquely European problem, but one that was also making Americans poorer too. All right, so next up in the article, we do have a short discussion on income taxes in Europe, although again, the data is incredibly misleading in my opinion. In Germany, the take-home pay of an average single worker after tax and benefits was 62.6% of their gross wage, not half. And while this is a higher overall cut when compared to the OECD average of 75.4%, the German taxes and benefits include taxes and social contributions. The American calculation does not. And now I've made multiple videos on this, but if you're really trying to truly paint an accurate picture of discretionary funds in a European versus an American paycheck, then you also need to subject that American income to things that aren't directly taken out of their paycheck, but are for a European worker. So you need to subtract healthcare premiums, you need to subtract daycare costs, you need to subtract the cost of student loan payments and their education. You also should probably take out some unemployment insurance, some long-term care insurance, and contributions to retirement savings. Because again, these all happen in European paychecks. So if you're gonna compare apples to apples, then let's do it. Now, the article effectively ends with the author launching into an anti-union section. And while I think there's a valuable discussion to be had on collective bargaining and paying workers an appropriate living wage, the angle that the article takes is to subtly imply that European workers are lazy, despite even acknowledging at one point that the shorter work week would improve workers' health and quality of life, while at the same time making the industry more attractive to younger workers. And gosh, yeah, that's the article. And if you want my 2 cents, again, this is all personal opinion, well, I did my research. I filmed and edited the video, and I went back to just check the article one more time, and they've changed the title of the article altogether. And curiously, the new title pretty much reflects what I'm just about to say. But I feel like that's kind of important to note. Back to the video. I found this article incredibly disappointing. Listen, is inflation a problem in Europe? Absolutely, I agree with the author. But inflation is also a problem in the United States too. And on that same note, is an aging workforce, particularly when we have to support different social programs, a problem in Europe? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was this huge uproar in France recently when they recently had to increase the age of retirement. But that's not a uniquely European problem. It's a problem in the United States too. We constantly talk about there not being enough funds in the Social Security program to actually be able to pay for people my age. I don't really get the angle there. these are things that we all have in common with one another. And the overall impression that I received from this article was that they're effectively saying that, you know, you might not have all of these other worker protections like unions and time off and quality healthcare, but hey, your paycheck's higher and you're richer, right? I mean, never mind that Americans have a spending problem and national debt goes unchecked. Never mind that 2/3 of all bankruptcy is due to medical debt in the United States because they're the only wealthy nation to not offer its citizens universal healthcare. But hey, your paycheck's slightly higher, right? Like, I don't know. Honestly, maybe I'm the problem because I don't think I will ever understand that argument. The argument that we either can't afford to treat our workers in the United States with what I feel are basic human rights, or that somehow it's better for a society to value a slightly higher paycheck in lieu of protecting them when things go south. And don't get me wrong, the system in Europe isn't perfect. There's still families in our community that are struggling to make ends meet. But the solidarity amongst European citizens to make sure that everyone in their community gets access to affordable healthcare, gets adequate time off to rest and recover, a guaranteed, paid higher education, low-cost childcare, and worker protections, even if that means it's in lieu of a lower paycheck. To me, that's what it feels to live a rich life. As always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. And for more content from the Black Forest family, hit that subscribe button. So, see you next Sunday. Tschüss!